Hey guys, Zomfox here, and today we're doing a video that you guys have been requesting for a very long time, basically a month now, and that is my ranking of every single wide receiver room in the United Football League. You guys have been asking for this ever since I started this series with the quarterback one, and, well, I'm finally giving it to you guys. As I said, I wanted to wait until the cuts happen. Now, we haven't gotten the full cuts, we're still waiting on the last 8 players to get cut in a couple weeks, but I wanted to do this one now because of the fact that we have had that massive amount of cuts happen. So the odds of us really needing to do another one or update this are pretty low. There's only a couple players that could get cut that would be a massive shock, and of course a couple guys that could sign. So this is being recorded on the 11th and will be posted on the 12th. So just as a heads up, in case any of you, are like, oh, this guy signed somewhere, why isn't he mentioned? That's why. Now without further ado, let's get started with the number 8, the DC Defenders. This is absolutely no shock. If you've been keeping up with the rosters, it's obvious this team is easily the worst. No offense to these guys, but when Kiki Cootie, Chris Rowland, and Brandon Smith are your top 3 receivers, yikes. Now, Vincent Smith could become one of those top 3 receivers as well, but Jazz Ferguson, Kelvin Harmon, and Ty Scott are very weak backups. The fact is, when you look at this team, Kiki Cootie was an NFL player from the Texans for a couple of years, and then the Colts. He had a couple times where he had a lot of promise, but he ended up just not really panning out. A lot of fumbling issues happened. Then Brandon Smith was their number 1 receiver that's returning. Lucky Jackson has gone on to the Vikings. So Brandon Smith is now the number 1 receiver who only had 118 yards this past season. And Chris Rowland, who only played in a couple of games but still only had 82 yards, so nothing to be, write home about. Because of all those issues, and because Vincent Smith is probably your best backup, who is a guy who has a lot of NFL experience, but still, this is obviously last place. Every other team has at least a guy that was top 20 in receiving yards. This team doesn't even have a guy that was top 30. So last place has to be them. Now, next is going to be the San Antonio Brahmas. Look, I know a lot of you Brahmas fans hate seeing them low on all these lists, but even you've got to admit it, this one, you can't really argue it. This is the only team that doesn't have a receiver that was top 10. The only one. Every other team had at least one dude that was a legit number 1 receiver. This team didn't have one, or doesn't have one. Jordan Vesey, Trey Kirkland, and Justin Smith are your probable starters. These guys were all 19, 22, and 16th respectively this past season. All were solid receivers, but again, none of these guys are screaming number 1. And even compared to the Showboats last year, even the Showboats had 2 guys that had over 300 yards. This team doesn't even have one that did that last year. Now, Marquez Stevenson could end up becoming one of the starters, but aside from that, you got Landon Akers, Matt Launders, Katie Cannon, Calvin Turner, and TJ Vasher. None of those guys are really big names in terms of your receiving core. So it's a pretty weak receiving core, but it is still better than the Defenders. You still have 3 guys who were top 30, whereas the Defenders didn't have one. So you do get better than last place, but again, you're still very weak, and I feel like this is one that even Brahmas fans have to admit is pretty fair. Now next is the Michigan Panthers. The Panthers lost their big addition in Corey Coleman. With Corey Coleman, this team legitimately is probably 4th. But because he retired and then Lance Lenore signed and now is already cut, yikes. Now, it is still better than the Brahmas. The fact is you have Devin Gray, Trey Quinn, and Jordan Sewell. Now, Devin Gray and Trey Quinn were both really good this past season. Devin Gray had 500 yards, Quinn had over 400. Trey Quinn was 11th in receiving yards, Devin Gray was 7th. So 2 really solid receivers. Jordan Sewell didn't play a full season, but didn't, again, just like we talked about earlier, didn't have, insane stats, only 130 yards. And then Pat Minn is a guy who is one of the keyer backups because of the fact that Marcus Sims, Devin Ross, and Samson Nakua have all played here before, have really done nothing. Pat Minn is a guy who is new here, has played in the NFL, was a 6th-round pick. Again, this is one of those where you have 2 really, really big threat receivers, which is why you're above the Brahmas. Because even though it's really 2 versus 3, your 2 are just substantially better than any of the Brahmas. Basically, these are the 2 best receivers across both teams. Then you'd probably have the 3 guys from the Brahmas, and then you'd get to, everybody else. So because of that, the Panthers get the 6th spot. Nothing to really write home about, just a really solid group, but every other group is better than this one. So, number 6. Now, number 5 is the Memphis Showboats. The only toss-up on the list is this one and number 4. That's it. That's the only toss-up. The Showboats could definitely be number 4. It depends on which ceiling guys you like better, which depth guys you like more. The thing with the Showboats is your starters are probably going to be Jonathan Adams, Vinny Papel, and DeAndre Overton. Adams was one of the best receivers this past year, top 10 receiving yards at 477. DeAndre Overton was 333. Vinny Papel was 345. Those 3 guys are also part of the trifecta that is this Showboats team. You have the John DeFilippo guy and Jonathan Adams, you have the Case Cookus guy and DeAndre Overton, and you have the Memphis Showboat guy and Vinny Papel. Then your backups are pretty solid too. Ryan McDaniel and Rashard Davis both were pretty good this past year, especially McDaniel. And then Lee Morris, D. Anderson, and D. Wood Davis or just some other depth pieces that a couple of them may end up getting cut. We might see. But these 5 guys on screen that I'm showing the stats for are a really solid group of guys. And you could, again, argue this team should be number 4. I have them at 5. I think it's really close. I actually would fully understand it to move them up one spot. But at least for me, I think 5 is where they should go. Really solid group. Again, you have a top 10 receiver in Jonathan Adams. But your backups as well are much better than, let's say, the Panthers or Brahmas. Ryan McDaniel would probably be a starter on both the Brahmas and the Panthers. Of course, he would be a starter in the Defenders. And so, since here he's like the 4th string guy, I mean, it makes sense that this team is at number 5. Now, number 4 is going to be the Renegades. You could very much argue the Renegades should be 5. Look, Deontay Burnett was an All-XFL player this past season, but as we talked about before, the All-XFL team was much easier to make than the All-USFL team at certain positions, and one of those was receiver, where there were 4 All-XFL receivers where he was the weakest of the 4. Still an All-XFL receiver, no disrespect, still a great season, but was the weakest of the 4, whereas the All-USFL team only had 2 wide receivers. So, if you were an All-USFL wide receiver, it's a much bigger deal than All-XFL receiver. Now, Deontay Burnett was still really good this past season. And this team benefits from having a lot of guys as well, just like the Showboats returning. Tyler Vaughns, Caleb Van Der Esch, and Javonte Payton are all returning, with Vaughns and Van Der Esch probably being starters. Both of these guys were pretty solid, but especially Vaughns. Vaughns had 300 yards, and Van Der Esch or Payton could really start. They both had over 160 yards, and then Winstead is one of your better backups in a sense, but a lot of question marks at the backup. Cy Barnett, Seth Green, Juwan Manigo, and LeJuan Winningham. A lot of questionable guys. It's very debatable which team you'd rather have. It's really, do you like Burnett more? Do you like Adams more? Do you like Vaughns more? Do you like Papel more? It's a toss-up. I'm just going with this one because of the cohesion that these guys have. You know, this is a group that's very much still the same as they were last year, and you're just adding Burnett to it. Whereas the Showboats, while you do still have 3 guys who are returning, you have a new coach, a new system in it. So I'm putting the Renegades at 4. It's definitely a really big toss-up, but I have them at 4. And number 3 is the Roughnecks. Look, I've seen a lot of people, make fun of or crap on C.J. Johnson, Curtis Johnson, about some of the cuts that happened. But the one thing you have to respect is his wide receiving coaching ability. We saw last year he was able to make a group that nobody really thought much of into one of the best receiving corps in the league, despite having a pretty mediocre quarterback. And proof of that is Justin Hall, who is probably the 3rd best receiver in spring football right now. He was an All-USFL player with Kenji Bahar as his quarterback, which Kenji Bahar was a very just mediocre quarterback, so the fact that he was able to pull that off is pretty incredible. Over 500 yards and over 300 yards after catch is incredible. He's not the only one. Isaiah Henney, another projected starter, is a big one. I talked about this before. The fact that they let Curtis Johnson get him is a crime. Isaiah Henney had over 300 yards after catch last year with early on worse quarterback play than when T-Will came in, better QB play than Justin Hall had. But again, you have 2 guys who are very similar, guys who can catch a lot of balls, and guys who had a huge amount of receiving yards, over 470 and over 300 yards after catch. Both had multiple touchdowns. Then Chisholm and ARW, either one of them will probably be the starter. I just like ARW a bit more. But either one of them could be the starter. They both had multiple touchdowns. Both had over 200 yards. And then Isaiah Zuber is one of your backups that, while he didn't do a ton last year, in 2022 he was the USFL TD leader in receiving TDs. And your other backups, Emmanuel Butler, Stephen Dunbar, Cecil Grayson, and Kirk Merritt, are, guys. But the fact is, I think that this is definitely a really solid group. Justin Hall and Isaiah Henney are, I would say, the 3rd best receiving duo in the whole league. Well, let me put it this way. At the moment, they're the 2nd best. At the moment, they're 2nd best, arguably number 1. I'll get to why that is at the moment. At this moment, with injuries, with question marks about guys coming back from injuries, I'd say they probably are the best receiving duo in the league. Because of the fact you have 2 guys who were both insanely high in receiving yards who didn't have great quarterbacks. Guys we'll get to with the Battlehawks and Stallions either had great QB play or, well, they had great QB play, but now there's injury concerns. So at the moment, this is the best receiving duo in the league. But again, that's at the moment and without seeing guys play, because there's a reason why I have them at 3. Because number 2 is the Stallions. Now I'll get to the first point about what I mean at the moment. Marlon Williams and Victor Bolden Jr. both have huge question marks. Can Marlon Williams fully return from the gruesome injury he had last season? And is Victor Bolden Jr. fully back now? He came to the Renegades, came really late, so he didn't have a huge impact with them. So the jury's still out on how good he is at the moment. If him and Williams are both fully healthy, they're better than Henney and Hall. But at the moment, you have to say that the other 2 are better. But as a room, I am still going. This is based on paper, and on paper, this is the 2nd best room. Deion Kane or Mitchell could start. I just put Kane there again. It's the guy I prefer a bit. But I would not be shocked if Amari Rodgers or Gary Jennings end up taking one of those roles. Both these guys have legit NFL experience and were highly touted prospects, 3rd and 4th round picks respectively. And then your other backups, your Kevin Austin, your Slade Bolden, your Benjamin Victor. Again, these are guys that may or may not make the roster for sure, but guys like Jennings and Rodgers could very well become starters, and your starting group can be insane. Marlon Williams should have been all at USFL in 2022, in my opinion, over Victor Bolden Jr., but Victor Bolden Jr. did get the nod for the second place, aside from Kvante Turpin. So you have two guys who were arguably the second and third best receivers in 2022, and if they're both back fully healthy, fully in the system, who knows what this team could be. I have a number 2. The number 1 is the Battlehawks with the asterisk in the starters because Ja'Cour Pearson is out. He's going to be out for a few weeks. He probably will return like midway through the season. So there's an asterisk there because he, at the moment, is not a starter, and that's why I'm saying at the moment. Even though Hakeem Butler and Darius Shepard is a really, really big threat duo, I'd argue I'd rather have Henne and Hall just because I saw what they did with worse quarterback play versus what I'm seeing here. And granted, they have pretty poor quarterback play, at least what we expect to see this upcoming season. But essentially, I think if you put both these duos with a good or bad quarterback, I think there's a good case that Henne and Hall do better than Shepard and Butler, but not better than Pearson and Butler. That's what I'm saying. So Pearson is out, so he has the asterisk there. The starter would probably be Blake Jackson in replace of him. He was another really good receiver this past season, as this team has 4 guys who were in the top 10 in receiving yards this past season. And when fully healthy, most people would agree with this, that Ja'Cour Pearson, Hakeem Butler, 2 best receivers in spring football. Thanks to the Corey Coleman retirement, there is no debate on that second place or even first place. So, 2 best guys. Then guys like Marcel Aitman and then, of course, Jamarcus Bradley. Both these guys have NFL experience, so you have some of those NFL experience guys as well. So you have 4 really good spring football guys, 2 guys that have experience, in the NFL, and then you have a few more backups. So comparing them to the Stallions, it's that sense that the Battlehawks have a better 1-2 punch in Hakeem and Pearson over Marlon and Victor. Then even though I'd give the NFL edge to the Stallions guys, in terms of your other 2 spring football guys, Deion Kane and Mitchell versus Shepard and Jackson, I mean, come on. So that's why I have the Battlehawks at number 1. Really, really good group. I've talked about this before. They are easily the best receiving group in the league. Now, again, the asterisk in the starter because Ja'Cour Pearson is out for a while, but we'll see. So overall, that'll do it for my list of ranking all the wide receiver rooms in the UFL. This is one that I think is pretty uncontroversial, I would say, even though my take of I'd rather have Henne and Hall above any other duo in the league, it might be considered controversial. I think that when you take into account the QBs that each guy has played with, I mean, Pearson and Butler played with McCarron and DiNucci, whereas, Henne played with like James Morgan, and a lot of people dislike T. Will. I think he's a good quarterback, just played bad in the championship. So that's kind of my take on it. But again, the Battlehawks, easily number 1. Stallions, I think, are easily number 2. Maybe you can argue the Roughnecks above them. 4 and 5 are contentious, but I think that the bottom half, especially like 8, 7, and 6 are very obvious in them. Let me know what you guys think down below in the comments. If you're new here and you like this content, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell to help support the channel. And if you want to support the channel even farther, you can become a channel member for as low as 99 cents a month. You can click the join button or the link in the description. There's a huge announcement coming up that I'm continuing to add to the channel memberships, so if you want to do that, I'd recommend becoming one today or tomorrow because I have an exclusive video coming out for channel members on the 15th. And as always, guys, have a great night.